All right, hope everybody's well. Moedim l'simcha, Erev Tov, everybody. And with this, our Parsha Shir has been moved this week. It's a short week, but we have twice as many Parsha Shirim. So I think that's like kind of cool. Tonight we finish up the laning for the year 5784, even though we're in 5785. The Torah reading, of course, Vzot Habracha. And tomorrow night at 8:30, David Harbader will be broadcasting from Jerusalem at 3:30 in the morning, but he wrote a book on Bereshit, and he says this is his favorite parsha. He wants to teach it. So tonight, Vzot Habracha, tomorrow, Bereshit. That will get you prepared for Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah. I guess for Simchas Torah, or we'll do the same thing in the laning. Okay, it's a pleasure to welcome back Dr. Moshe Sokolow, who really needs no introduction, I'm sure, to everybody here. I'm a regular, although it's been a little while since we've had him give a series, but over the years he's given many shirim for us. Torah Moshe as a prolific author on many fields, an expert in Tanakh, and is the official title of the Associate Dean of the Israeli School at Yeshiva University. And I think, I don't know, you're past your golden anniversary of teaching at YU, I imagine, Doctor?
I'm approaching the Arba'im Shana Akut B'dor.
Oh, just the Arba'im Shana Akut. I hope you're not in the meat bar, but and you're fucked up. But anyway, it's a pleasure to have you, and we look forward to it's really one of the most difficult parshat in Torah. We hear it over and over, but who pays attention to Vzot Habracha? Okay, Bakasha, Dr. Sokolow, you'll enlighten us, I am sure.
Okay, so good evening to all. I guess I'll start where Rabbi Kelman opened the door. It's a question about to which liturgical cycle does the Sidra of Vzot Habracha belong? And the curious thing is that you have to ask yourself, well, how many Sidarim or Sidrot should there be? So the answer is, well, let's figure out how many Shabbatot are there in a year. So, of course, there are fewer Shabbatot in a lunar year than there are in a solar year. So let's just go with the larger number. How many Shabbatot should there be in a solar year? So a solar year is 365 days. Divide that by 7, you come out with 52. But the 52 is with a remainder of 1. That means that if January 1st is on a Saturday, right, then you can have not 52 Shabbatot in that solar year, but you can have 53 Shabbatot in that solar year. So arguably, there should be 53 Sidarim. And in fact, curious thing is that a very important collection of commentaries on the weekly Sidra, written by the Balei HaTosafot in the 12th and 13th centuries, was called Sefer Hagan. And it was called Sefer Hagan because the numerical value of Gimel Nun is 53. And it reflects the fact that at least at that point in time, the people in northern France thought that there were 53 Sidarim in a liturgical cycle. Of course, if you were open a Chumash now and start counting the number of Sidarim or Parashiot, as they are often called, you'll find that there are only 52. So, question is whether there's a missing link or whether they're just simply, if it was necessary, took a Torah reading that we usually do in 1 week and divided it into 2. But in any event, as I said, be that as it may, I will let you into the sources, and I will share with you what I want to do this evening. So here we go. Okay, so I called it an exegetical medley because we're going to look at 3 different themes as they relate to the Sidra of Vzot Habracha. And the first one is called a change in the lineup. I thought this being the season of Major League Baseball championships and upcoming World Series, something in Yonei Diyoma. In Vzot Habracha, Moshe Rabbeinu bestows blessings upon the tribes. A similar thing happened at the close of Sefer Bereshit, where Yaakov Avinu bestowed blessings upon the tribes. And the curious thing is that neither in the case of Yaakov Avinu nor in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu does the sequence in which the Shvatim receive their blessings seem to make any sense. So let's start with the actual lineup. Let's look at the actual birth order of the 12 sons of Jacob. So that's listed here on the very top line. First, there were 4 children born to Leah, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. And then, as you recall, Rachel gave her Shivcha, Bilhah, to Yaakov, and she gave birth to Dan and Naphtali. Then Leah picked up on the idea and gave Zilpah to Yaakov, and she gave birth to Gad and Asher. And then Leah herself had 2 more children, Yisachar and Zevulun. And finally, Rachel herself had 2 children, Yosef and Binyamin. Okay. So this is the birth order. I place Ephraim and Manasseh in parentheses. They, of course, were children of Yosef because they feature prominently both in the brachot of Yaakov and in the brachot of Moshe Rabbeinu. So let's take a look first at the first question. In what order did Yaakov bless his sons? Now, the Sidra that we'll read this on Simchat Torah is actually called Vzot Habracha. It actually has the word bracha in its title. The Sidra in which Yaakov talks to his sons is only called Vayechi. There's no word bracha in the title. That's why I put it in quotation marks, because given what he had to say to Shimon and Levi, which was rather critical and somewhat caustic, really difficult to describe it as a blessing. But in any event, let's take a look and see what the sequence is. So first, he blessed his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he didn't even bless them in their birth order, which was Manasseh and Ephraim, but he inverted their birth order, and only subsequently did he turn to his own sons. Then he begins, as we would expect him to begin, with Reuven, the firstborn, and he continues in order with Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. But then instead of going, you get it back up there, instead of going to Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, he skips to Yisachar and Zevulun. Right? And by the way, he inverts their birth order as well, blessing Yisachar before Zevulun. Then come the 4 children of the Shefachot, Dan, Gad, Asher, and Naphtali. Once again, you can see that the birth sequence is out of order. And finally, he gets to Yosef and Binyamin. So the question is there any logic to this? So I have some possible answers. One is that the precedence that Yaakov gave to Ephraim and Manasseh was simply contextual. That is, because Yosef brought them along with him on his visit to his father, and as long as they were there, although it was coincidental, he gave them a baracha. Now, why, however, did he invert their birth order and bless Ephraim before Manasseh? I don't need to give an answer to that because Yosef posed the same question to his father, and his father gave his own answer to it. And that is that he says, don't worry about it. He says, that's what I want to do. And if we think about it, it's certainly not the first time that the birth order of 2 brothers was inverted. If we go all the way back to the very beginning of time, Cain and Hevel, right? Hevel was given precedence over Cain, even though Cain was born first, okay? Yitzchak was given precedence over Yishmael, even though Yishmael was born first, okay? Yaakov was given precedence over Esav, even though Esav was born first. And similarly in the 2 sons of Yehuda, Peretz and Zerach, even though they were actually born in the order of Zerach and Peretz. So what does this have to do? So this is a theme that runs throughout Sefer Bereshit, the theme of the younger son excelling or outdoing their sibling. Okay. second item. Okay, so Ephraim and Menashe were an afterthought. Okay, the planned brachot that Yaakov intended to give begin correctly with the firstborn Reuven, and as I said, by continuing through Yehudah, they give the impression that Yaakov intended to follow the birth order all the way through. However, he interrupts the birth order with Yisachar and Zevulun, and that gives us pause to wonder whether, in fact, he intended to bless them, not necessarily in the order in which they were born absolutely, but in the order in which they were born to their mothers, their respective mothers. Therefore, since Yisachar and Zevulun were brothers to Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehudah, being born of both the same father, Yaakov, and the same mother, Leah, that would very well explain why he grouped them together. Why, in that order, he did invert the sequence of Zevulun and Yisachar has no apparent reason, and nobody asked Yaakov about it, so we don't know what he had in mind. Now, then he comes to the children of the Shefachot, and once again, there is a somewhat of an inversion of a birth order, and once again, the postponement of Naphtali until after Gad and Asher rather than following Dan similarly has no apparent reason. And the brachot of Yaakov conclude properly with the last two sons born to him, Yosef and Binyamin. So we see that the brachot of Yaakov, half of them, right, seem to have some rhyme and reason to it, while the other half, not so much. Now, in what order does Moshe give brachot to these same shvatim? So he too begins with Reuven. So that's something that they have in common. And we might draw some sort of conclusion from that. And that is that in an era in which polygamy was practiced and men had more than one wife, okay, nevertheless, the firstborn child of whomever he was married to is nevertheless the Bachor and always takes pride of first place. So, beginning with Reuven, the firstborn, seems to be SOP, standard operating practice. However, there's no bracha given to Shimon. He goes directly to Yehudah and to Levi, though inverting the order, okay? The elimination of Shimon is without an obvious reason, although we might offer one. Just as Yaakov, in his last will and testament, did not give Shimon and Levi a bracha as much as he criticized them for their rash behavior in the episode of Dinah at Shechem, it could be that Moshe, by overlooking Shimon, was delivering a similar message, since the tribe of Shimon had arguably incurred his anger, God's anger, and some sense of reproach or opprobrium due to the activities of Zimri, who consorted with one of the Midianite princes and was then responsible for the spreading of a plague among the Jewish people. So, again, the elimination of Shimon is without an obvious reason, although the behavior of Zimri is suggestive, and I give you a reference to Ibn Ezra, who seems to hint at that, as perhaps is the inversion of Yehudah and Levi, although it could be that Moshe mentioned Yehudah before Levi because he was trying very hard not to treat his own tribe prejudicially, right? Remember, of course, that Moshe was himself a Levi. Then, however, the birth sequence seems to be interrupted by Yosef and Binyamin. Now, that, I suggest, could be an attempt to distribute the brachot on a more equitable basis based upon their mothers. So he begins with the children of Leah, and then he moves to the children of Rachel, before then moving back to the remaining children of Leah and the children of the Shefachot. So again, the interpolation of Yisachar and Zevulun may also be inspired by their matrilineal descent, an attempt to group the children of Leah and Rachel together at the beginning with the children of Bilhah and Zilpah together at the end. And once again, just as in the brachot of Yaakov, we find that precedence over Yisachar, and again, with no apparent reason. Similarly, there's no apparent reason for the precedence that Moshe gives to the tribe of Gad over those of Dan and Naphtali, nor for that matter for his separation of Gad from his brother Asher. Now, is this the only place in which sequences are altered? No. Here's another example. Okay, you'll remember Tzlofchad. Tzlofchad had 5 daughters, right? They're the ones who protested to Moshe Rabbeinu that if land was apportioned only to men, right, then they would be left out because their father had no sons, and arguably his nachala, his land apportioned, would revert to his brothers. So Moshe took their case, argued their case before God, and God acquiesced, as it were, right? And they were able to share in their father's land portion, with the proviso that they had to be married to cousins, to members of the same tribal family. So, what were the names of his daughters? There are 3 psukim in which all 5 daughters appear. In 2 of them, they appear in the following order. Machla, I should add parenthetically that every so often I have to correct the Baal Koreh, who somehow thinks that Tzlofchad's oldest daughter was Machala. Of course, there's a big difference. Machala is an illness. Machla is like limchol, forgiveness, overlooking, consideration. Okay. So the order is Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, and Tirza. So again, that appears on 2 separate occasions. On a 3rd occasion, however, the order is slightly inverted. Machla is still first, like Reuven, I suppose, since she was the firstborn child of Tzlofchad. Every time his children are mentioned, she will be mentioned first. But now, Tirza, who in 2 occasions was last, now is in 2nd place, while Noah, Chogla, and Milka are in the same seat in every occasion. Now, do we have to explain it? Is there a necessity to explain why in 2 instances the sequence is one way, and in the 3rd instance the sequence varies? On one hand, we could say, no. I mean, listen, anytime you have to list things, something's going to be first, something's going to be the last, and if there are more than 2 things, something's going to be stuck in the middle. So on the one hand, you can say that we really need to attach no great significance to an alteration of order, particularly as in the case of the daughters of Tzlofchad, where it's such a slight variation. Rashi and the Midrash, however, thought otherwise. And here's Rashi on the pasuk in which the order is inverted. He says, Kan, in this instance, as opposed to the 2 previous ones, Mina'an lefi gedulatan zo mizo b'shanim. That in fact it is only in this pasuk and not in the previous 2 in which they are listed in their birth order. V'nis'u b'seder toldotan. Maybe they even went ahead and got married in the order in which they were born, the eldest first and the youngest last. So what's this pasuk in which the order is inverted, says Rashi? Uvechol hamikra mina'an lefi chochmatan umagid shesh kulot zo kezo. Rashi basically tells us that the reason that the order is inverted is basically tell us that it is inconsequential, right? Of course, chronologically, one had to have been born first and the other had to have been born last. But in terms of their importance, in terms of their presentation, in terms of their character, they were alike. Okay. Now, the Chama Leibovitz actually dealt with this in one of her iyunim. And she wrote as follows. There's actually a quotation. The reader may think that the interpreter is burdening the change in sequence with a significance it really lacks. As I said, why do you have to explain why one pasuk is out of order? What difference does it make? Okay, that's not the case, says Nechama Leibovitz. Perhaps we can endear the exegetical approach to the contemporary consciousness, that is, to appeal to us, by citing a detail from, of all things, a Shakespearean play, Hamlet. Okay? The king, who murdered his brother, and the queen summon two wicked courtiers, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and induce them to spy on Hamlet and reveal to them his secrets. And here are two lines from the play. The king says, "Thanks, Rosencrantz and gentle Guildenstern." The queen says, "Thanks, Guildenstern and gentle Rosencrantz." Do we read significance into it? Do we say the queen deliberately inverted the sequence of the king? Or do we say, he said one thing, she said the other. In both cases, both of them are mentioned. What difference does it make? Nechama Leibovitz's reading was, this informs us that they are regarded equally by both the king and queen, and neither one is given preference. Obviously, not that neither one is given preference. Each of them is given preference in each of two distinct utterances, lest they become jealous of one another. And the reason then is so that they may devote themselves wholeheartedly to the dastardly plot. So indeed, as I said, you still have your choice. You can decide that the alteration of sequence is fraught with significance. You may remember this from some of my earlier classes, right? I call this the international signal for pilpul, okay? If you want, you can decide that, as I said, that the alteration of sequence is significant, and you can try to attach significance to it. Or you can say that as long as everybody ends up getting mentioned one way or the other, any alteration in the sequence is just simply, of secondary, or minor, or tangential importance. So much for topic 1. Topic 2, I have labeled the kiss of death. I thought that too might be somewhat timely. We're getting close to Halloween. Ghosts, goblins, witches, skeletons. Okay. One of the very last psukim in the Torah describes the conditions or circumstances under which Moshe Rabbeinu passes away. It says, "Vayamot sham Moshe eved Hashem be'eretz Moab." There in the land of Moab, Moses, the servant of the Lord, passed away. If you prefer, he died. Okay? And then it adds 3 or perhaps 2, if you consider hyphenated words, one conjoined word, 2 or 3 words, al pi Hashem. Now, what does al pi Hashem mean? I brought you the old Jewish Publication Society translation, according to the word of the Lord. What would it mean according to the word of the Lord? It would mean, if you think back, God told Moshe, as he told Aharon, that they would not be able to enter the land of Israel. Therefore, it was a forlorn conclusion that Moshe would die before the people crossed the Jordan River. Therefore, Moshe indeed passes away in the land of Moab, which is in Transjordan, al pi Hashem, just as God had said, predicted, stipulated, whatever you want to call it. All right? I brought another pasuk in which the phrase al pi Hashem appears not even once but twice. Okay? Al pi Hashem yis'u v'nei Yisrael, in describing their movement through the wilderness, it says that the children of Israel broke camp and traveled al pi Hashem, va'al pi Hashem yachanu, and when it came time for them to stop traveling and to set up camp anew, It was similarly al pi Hashem. Kol yemei asher yishkon he'anan al hamishkan yachanu, and they would remain there as long as the anan rested upon the mishkan. So what does al pi Hashem there mean? Pi Hashem there means not just merely according to the word of God, it means really according to God's command or God's instruction, right? God would tell them when to move, God would tell them when to stop, okay? In neither of these cases does al pi Hashem, is al pi Hashem anything more than a figure of speech, okay? And yet, look at Rashi, okay? On this pasuk, here's the Rashi. Rashi says, al pi Hashem bin nishika. Rashi explains the pasuk to mean that how did Moshe die in the land of Moab? He died by God kissing him. So Rashi, the Midrash actually, takes the words al pi Hashem not figuratively, but it takes them quite literally. Okay, what does it mean for that? God, how does Moses die from being kissed by God? I don't know. Okay? I can imagine. I imagine that if death is simultaneous with or synonymous with the withdrawal of your soul, right? And your soul, while you are alive, is personified in your breath, okay? Then what we have here is the opposite of CPR, okay? In CPR, you breathe into somebody to give them life. If you think about it, that's how we all started, okay? We all started. What gave God's very first human being life? Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim, right? That God inspired Adam. He breathed into him. So if breathing into somebody instills life in them, arguably, right? If you suck the breath out of somebody, that would be synonymous with death. So perhaps that's what nishika means. But the Gemara goes a bit further. The Gemara says as follows: Tanu Rabbanan, Shisha lo shalat bahen malach hamavet. There are 6 people who were invulnerable to the angel of death. That doesn't mean that they didn't die, but it means that they didn't die the way people ordinarily die. If the way people ordinarily die is expressed theologically by their being visited by the angel of death, then there were 6 people who were invulnerable to the angel of death, and therefore they had to have died some other way. Who were they? Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aharon, and Miriam. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, how do we know that they were invulnerable to the angel of death? Dichtiv b'hu bakol mikol kol. You may recognize those words. They're part of Birkat HaMazon, right? So if they had everything, then one of the things they had to have had was invulnerability to the angel of death. Okay, and you see Rashi's comment there on the Gemara, Klomar lo chasru kol tova, right? That they said that they lacked for nothing. Now, what about Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam? Because in each of them it says that they died al pi Hashem. Therefore, dying al pi Hashem means that they died in a manner that is uncommon, unusual, that not through the intermediary of the malach hamavet, of the angel of death. Now, the Gemara asks itself a question. V'ha Miriam lo ktiv ba'al pi Hashem? It does say that the death of Aharon was al pi Hashem. And it surely says, as we see right here, that the death of Moshe was al pi Hashem. But the words al pi Hashem do not appear in reference to the death of Miriam. So by virtue of what is she lumped together with Aharon and Moshe? So of course, even without reading the Gemara further, I would have an answer of my own. And that is, well, they were 3 siblings. They were all special. They were all prophets. So if Moshe and Aharon merited that their deaths were directly inspired by God rather than by the ordinary Malach HaMavet, then why not Miriam too? But the Gemara has a different answer, from which we learn an interesting lesson. It says, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Miriam nami bin shika meta. Indeed, it's true that she too died with a kiss, as it were. However, mipnei ma lo ne'emar ba'al pi Hashem, so why doesn't it just say so? Shegnai hadavar lomar. Think about it, right? Because it would be unseemly to suggest that God kissed her. Now, I suggest that given that God has no actual human physical characteristics, and that it's only a linguistic convention to describe God as being possessed of corporeal features, like a mouth, and it's similarly only linguistic convention to describe God as masculine, right? Because if God has no corporeal features, then he has no gender. He, she has no gender. I don't really know. We have to ask God. There are so many pronouns today that can be used, that people use, such a wide variety of pronouns. I wonder which one God would choose for himself, herself, itself, whatever. I actually saw, I think, in two sources, in Dvorah Steinmetz's book and in Yitz Greenberg's latest book, where they actually use, instead of talking about God as himself or herself, they just simply created a word, God's self. In any event. So, that since God has no physical characteristics and describing God as masculine is only a linguistic convention, then the Gemara, by telling us that it would be Gnai to describe Miriam as being kissed by God, is not a theological insight, but actually just the other way around, an anthropological one. Namely, what I derive from this is a lesson that if one truly desires to abide by Pi Hashem, by the mouth of God, right, by God's speech, then one should observe modesty in speech as well as modesty in action. Maimonides, too, in the guide, has an observation on this notion of dying binishika, and he says in the guide, the meaning of this saying is that these three, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, died in the midst of the pleasure derived from the knowledge of God and their great love for him. When our sages figuratively call the knowledge of God, united with intense love for him, a kiss, they're following a well-known poetical diction, meaning it's a figure of speech. It reverts to being a figure of speech. And he cites Pasuk in Shir Hashirim, Yishakeni minishikot pihu. Now remember again, on the literal plane, that is a woman describing her lover. And she's saying, I wish he would kiss me. But it's understood as a metaphor, if you wish. It's understood to reflect the relationship of God and the Jewish people. So if the relationship between God and the Jewish people is described as the Jewish people ask God to kiss them, it means that they want him to share the Torah with them. This kind of death, which in truth is deliverance from death, has been ascribed by our sages to none but Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And that brings us to our third subject for the evening. Famous last words, to which I add the question, but whose words are they? And we're talking about literally the last words in the Torah. Not the last words of Moses, not his blessing to the tribes. We covered that already. We're talking literally about the last words, the last few sentences in the Torah. So here we go. Here's Rashi on Pasuk Hey in the chapter 34, which is the final chapter in Devarim. The verse that we saw previously, the one that describes Moses as dying al pi Hashem. Okay? Says Rashi, sorry. The verse says, Moses died. Rashi asks an obvious question. Efshar Moshe meit v'katav vayamot sham? Could Moses speak of himself as having died? Okay. Of course not. Ella, rather, who wrote Vayamot Sham Moshe, that Moses died there? Mikan va'elach katav Yehoshua. That is, not only the words Vayamot Sham Moshe, but the remaining 8 psukim in the Torah, beginning with Vayamot Sham Moshe, were written by Yehoshua. This is not Rashi's original opinion. It's taken from the Gemara in Bava Batra. Okay? So is the statement that follows. Rabbi Meir disagrees. Rabbi Meir says, Efshar Sefer Torah chaser klum. Could it be that up until this point, right, that a Torah that was missing the last 8 verses, an incomplete Torah, and yet it's described previously in Sefer Dvarim, where Moshe tells Yoshua and the Jewish people, La koach et Sefer HaTorah hazeh, take this Torah, right, and study it. So what Torah was he referring to? I'm assuming that he's referring to the entire Torah. So how can he refer to the entire Torah if 8 psukim were missing from it? Rather, says Rabbi Meir, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer, that even the last 8 psukim of the Torah were written by Moshe, but they were written differently from the way he wrote the remainder of the Torah. In the remainder of the Torah, God would dictate and Moshe would write. With the last 8 psukim, says Rabbi Meir, God dictated them, but when Moshe wrote them down, it was b'dema. Meaning that, how would you expect Moshe to describe the circumstances of his own death, particularly since he understood that his death, right, which obviously had not come yet if he was still able to write the last 8 psukim in the Torah, was simply was depriving him of what might have been his life's greatest ambition, namely the opportunity to enter the land of Israel. Okay, so we have a machloket in the Gemara in Bava Batra between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Shimon says that the last 8 psukim in the Torah had to have been written by Yehoshua because it is simply inconceivable that Moshe Rabbeinu could write and describe the circumstance, could say about himself in honesty that he died. Now, of course, he could say it prophetically, right? But yet, there's something to be said for the argument that Moshe Rabbeinu, right, the ultimate man of truth, right, could not sit and write the words, Moses died. Okay. As opposed to Rabbi Meir, who says, yes, he could write them because God dictated, and whatever God dictated, Moses wrote, but surely we can grant him this human response, and that he wrote it tearfully. Now, here's where it gets interesting. That pasuk, if you recall, was Dvarim Perek Lamed Dalet Pasuk Hey. 8 psukim from the end of the Torah. This is Dvarim Lamed Dalet Pasuk Aleph. 4 psukim earlier. Okay. In this pasuk it says, and you can see it here, on the right-hand side, Vaya'al Moshe me'arvot Moav el Har Nevo. That Moses, right, died on Har Nevo. How did he get to Har Nevo? He had to have climbed the mountain. Where was Moshe before he climbed the mountain? He was in the Israelite camp in Arvot Moab. So before Moses could write of himself that he died on Har Nevo, he had to ascend Har Nevo. Okay? Ibn Ezra says as follows, Lefi da'ati, right? My own personal opinion, says Ibn Ezra, Ki mizeh hapasuk katav Yehoshua. The Gemara was prepared to grant Yehoshua 8 psukim in the Torah. Ibn Ezra is extending that to 12 psukim in the Torah. Why? compelling logic. Ki achar she'ala Moshe lo yarad. After Moses left the camp in Arvot Moav and descended Har Nevo, he didn't go back down, right? And when he went up to Har Nevo, he was unaccompanied. So, from the moment that it says that Moshe ascended Har Nevo, he could no longer have written anything. Therefore, okay, Ki achar shala Moshe lo yarad. Now, ubederech nivu'ah ketavo, kedichtiv, right? V'ha'ed vayareu Hashem et kol ha'aretz vayomer Hashem elav gam vayikboroto, etc. And that these psukim were written how? How did Yehoshua know what happened to Moshe after he ascended Har Nevo? How did Yehoshua know that God granted Moshe a panoramic view of the land of Israel? How did Yehoshua know that God himself, as it were, saw to Moses' burial? Clearly, says Ibn Ezra, Yehoshua was a prophet. It must have been binuvu'ah. It had to have been prophetic. Now, does Ibn Ezra have the right to disagree with the Gemara? Well, I ask a question. There are different kinds of statements in rabbinic literature. Some are categorical statements for which they claim tradition as a source, okay? And others aren't so much categorical statements as they are argumentative. Namely, rabbis will look at a question and they can do one of two things. They can either say, we have a tradition, or they can say, I see it this way, and another one will say, but I see it differently. Arguably, when the rabbi settles something by saying this is a tradition, which usually means that it is unquestioned, okay, then we take that at face value. When, however, they come to a conclusion, because after arguing the different interpretations, they take a vote and they side with the majority, what happens to the minority opinion? Does it necessarily mean that the minority was wrong? No. It just means that they weren't the majority. When the Gemara says that Yehoshua wrote 8 psukim in the Torah, it doesn't state that categorically. Because if it were a categorical statement, if it was simply somebody saying, I have a tradition, I heard from my teacher who heard from his teacher that Yehoshua wrote the last 8 psukim in the Torah, then that would be the end of the discussion in the Gemara. They would say, well, if that's what we had in tradition, that Yehoshua wrote 8 psukim in the Torah, then that must be it. But that's not the case. As we saw, the Gemara discusses it argumentatively. It comes up with a reason for attributing the last 8 verses to Yehoshua. Namely, the argument that Moshe, right, could not describe the circumstances, the conditions of his own death. Therefore, I guess what Ibn Ezra says is that you've opened Pandora's box. Once you've said that the attribution of psukim in the Torah to somebody other than Moshe can be made not only on the basis of a tradition, but on the basis of logical argument, then you can't shut logic off. Therefore, says Ibn Ezra, if the argument is that any pasuk in the Torah that reflects a condition or a circumstance that could only have been described by someone other than Moshe Rabbeinu, then, says Ibn Ezra, you have to include not only the last 8 psukim in the Torah, but you have to include the 4 psukim that precede it. And that's not all. Because if you look now at Ibn Ezra, in the very beginning of Sefer Devarim, the very first pasuk in Sefer Devarim, okay? The first pasuk in Sefer Devarim says, Ela hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael, right? This is how Moses addressed the people of Israel before his death. Now tell me, Sefer Devarim, beginning with the next pasuk, is Moshe Rabbeinu, throughout Sefer Devarim, speaks in the first person. What's the name of the second parasha in Sefer Devarim? Va'etchanan, in the first person, okay? Doesn't say about Moshe va'yitchanen el Hashem. Moshe says of himself, va'etchanan. So if all of Sefer Devarim is Moshe speaking in the first person, how should Sefer Devarim begin? It should begin with Ela hadvarim asher dibarti el kol Yisrael be'ever hayarden. If instead of that, in using the first person, it says Ela hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael, speaking of Moshe in the third person, well, says Ibn Ezra, then it's not Moshe, but it's somebody else. Therefore, but he doesn't come right out and say it. He says it in a somewhat enigmatic fashion. And this is what he says. He says, Im tavin sod hashnei masar. He says, if you understand or you appreciate the enigma or the mystery or the esoteric notion relating to 12, right? Go to the last two words, takir hayemet, then you will recognize the truth. What is the Sod Shnei Masar? Arguably, the Sod Shnei Masar is Ibn Ezra that we just saw, who extended Yehoshua's authorship in the Torah beyond the 8 psukim attributed to him in the Gemara by adding 4 more psukim for a total of 12. Therefore, what Ibn Ezra is saying here at the beginning of Sefer Devarim is very simple. He's saying, if you understand that what I've argued is that once you discuss this question based on logic, and you're stipulating that anything in the Torah that appears to have been written by somebody other than Moshe, either because it describes circumstances that Moshe was unaware of or unacquainted with, or because they happen to be posthumous, then, says Ibn Ezra, if you understand that we extend that principle not only beyond the last 8 psukim to include the last 12, but we can use it to even go beyond that. And he gives a small sampling here. He uses the verse in Dvarim, Vayichtov Moshe, or the verse in Bereshit, Vaknani az ba'aretz, or the one at the end of the Akedah, where Avraham names the place in which the Akedah took place as Vayikra Avraham et Shem Makom Hahu Hashem Yireh. Right? But then there is a little suffix to the pasuk which says Asher Ye'amer Hayom Bahar Hashem Yireh. As people today refer to the mountain to which people go on the Shalosh Regalim as Har Hashem, as God's mountain. If you look in the Torah never tells you where God's mountain is. Torah never says where the Beit HaMikdash is going to be built. The Torah always refers to it as Hamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem L'Shaken Shmo Sham. Whatever place it will be in which God will enshrine God's self. Okay? So could Moshe have already known that the mountain on which the Akedah took place was the mountain on which the Beit HaMikdash was going to be built? Yes, he could have known. But on the other hand, since throughout the rest of the Torah he makes no such declaration, Ibn Ezra is suggesting that the identification of that mountain with the mountain of the Beit HaMikdash had to have been post-Mosaic. It had to have been added later than Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, who might have added it? That Ibn Ezra doesn't tell us. But for that, we have in the addition of someone who was rather close in time to Ibn Ezra and wrote a commentary on Ibn Ezra, one of the Balei HaTosafot, a northern French scholar named Rabbi Yossi Tuv Elem. And on kind of the constraints of time, let's just go to the highlighted portion at the end. And he gives the following explanation or rationalization for Ibn Ezra. And he says as follows: V'achar sheyesh lanu laha'amin b'divrei Kabbalah u'v'divrei nevuah, since we are called upon by the Torah to listen not only to the word that we know was dictated by God to Moshe, but the Torah always also tells us that we have to listen to other prophets, later prophets. Okay? Therefore, if we are obligated to listen to words of prophecy, then Mali shektavo Moshe oktavo navi acher. Then what difference does it really make who added those words to the Torah? Even if there are words in the Torah that were added after Moshe, as long as they were added by a prophet, ho'il v'divrei kulam emet v'hem b'nevuah. So what does it matter whether were there 8 psukim written by Yehoshua or 12 psukim written by Yehoshua, or whether, as other parshanim like Abarbanel argue from time to time, perhaps added even later than Yehoshua, perhaps even added at the time of Shmuel. Now, of course, this approach is an unorthodox one. I would, however, maintain that as unorthodox as it might be, it's still not anti-orthodox. And that's because we usually have a mistaken understanding of just what our belief in the divinity of the Torah is supposed to require of us. So I brought here at the end the conventional formulation of the 8th of Maimonides' 13 Articles of Faith. Now you have to know one thing. These 13 Articles of Faith, as they appear in your Sidurim after Shacharit, were not written by Maimonides. Okay? They're a condensation of a much longer discussion of 13 Articles of Faith that Maimonides has in his commentary on the Mishnah to the Perek Chelek in Sanhedrin. Okay? And in this case, it does it an injustice. Literally, it says as follows, and what I give you here is the Lord's translation. Right? This is straight out of the Sachs Sidur. Okay? I believe with perfect faith that the entire Torah now in our hands is the same one that was given to Moses, our teacher. That's a correct and proper translation. Okay? Except that's not what Rambam originally wrote. If this is all you know, then you would really believe that Rambam meant for us to believe that every word in the Torah was written by Moshe. But that's not what he really wrote. What he really wrote, and I'll just limit it here, this, as I said, from his commentary on the Mishnah. Let's just simply look at the sentence that I highlighted, and I'm going to go to the English because he didn't write it in Hebrew anyway, he wrote it in Arabic. We believe that this Torah that is given to us through Moshe, our teacher, is completely from the mouth of God, Pi Hashem, right? We were talking about earlier, right? Which is to say that it all came from God in a manner that is metaphorically called speech. Rambam does not require us to believe that every word in the Torah was written by Moshe. Rambam requires us to believe that every word in the Torah, regardless of by whom it was written only because God dictated it. If you wish, it's the difference between Torah min hashamayim and Torah mi Sinai. Rambam is not mandating a belief in Torah mi Sinai, that every word in the Torah was written by Moshe. Rambam is mandating a belief in Torah min hashamayim, that every word in the Torah, regardless of by whom it was written, was dictated by God. Well, That is pretty much what I had to say. And I don't see the chat. So if there was one, is one, I can't. Is there any? We just ask if there are any questions.
Yeah, I had a question. Is it possible that Rabbi Shimon, who's the person who says that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't complete the Torah, Yehoshua did, says that because he's biased, because Shimon doesn't get a blessing from Moshe Rabbeinu?
That's the best answer I've ever heard. I think it's highly unlikely, but why not?
Could you, and since you have some time, could you just explain Bakol Mikol Kol, explain exactly what the verse really means and tells us, and link it to the Neshika?
Well, there are three different verses. It says, Vashem berachat Avram bakol. And then with Yitzchak, there's a pasuk in which the word mikol is used, and with Yaakov, there's a pasuk which has the word kol. They don't all three appear in one pasuk. The only place in which they appear all together, as I said, is in Birkat HaMazon.
Uh-huh.
And it's just to say that they were, that they had everything. And different people interpret everything differently.
I would say, can
we just, I don't mind continuing, but let me just ask first whether there's anybody else who might have a question. Please, go ahead.
I'm just thinking about inclusions. Is it possible that the breath that God used to create man and the hiss of Moses is a biblical inclusion?
Dan, I didn't get that.
It creates what we call a conclusio to the Torah. Begins with the creation of man by God's breath and ends with the withdrawal of breath from Moshe Rabbeinu.
I'm flattered because you accepted my interpretation of the significance of Neshika. If that indeed is so, then yes, it could be seen that way. But I really did. This was off the top of my head, so I'm still a little skeptical even of my own interpretation.
Well, I would grant it the level of pshat.
That's the highest level. I'm flattered again.
Rabbi, can I ask a question? If OP Hashem is metaphorical, is there any reason to dismiss biblical criticism?
I don't think that one has any bearing on the other.
Well, if anybody could have written anything at a later date, then
Again, I purposely and deliberately included that statement by the early commentator on Ibn Ezra to understand that the traditional belief is that there may be words in the Torah that were not written by Moses, but they had to have been written by a prophet. I don't think that biblical criticism subscribes to the notion of prophecy.
Moshe mi piatzmo. That's the problem. That's I think the Gemara says that's the heresy.
Right, and that's what Rambam exactly.
Right.
That's exactly what Rambam meant in his belief that it has to be Sinai. Yes.
Yeah, but that's not right.
Besides, I should just point out that biblical criticism still is the longest lasting, and until recently, the most widespread conspiracy theory ever hatched. There's never been an item or a shred of historical, documentary, or literary evidence for it. It is a conspiracy theory.
So interestingly, just that's a little bit of a segue. I'm not really exactly familiar with what he's going to say, but our speaker tomorrow night on Bereshit, actually, his book deals with the issues of biblical criticism, sort of within a traditional framework. That's going to be the shiur tomorrow night. What do they call it? The two understandings of creation, where there's the whole Mordechai Breuer approach. I think this is a huge topic that we're not going to cover in sort of the question and answer period at the end of a shiur. Is there any the Mordechai Breuer approach that there are different quote unquote
There's a newer one.
yeah, Sefer Tmurot by
Yes, there's a newer one. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's what you're referring to, right? Where it's Mordechai Breuer's approach is the Torah is full of contradiction, except many of the premises, but they're all written by God. In other words, that's but this is really a topic I think we would need a much broader, much longer series of shiurim, and something to consider, if people are interested, how to deal with it, to ignore it, attack it, or sort of deal with the issues that raised from a traditional framework. But on a more mundane note, I did write you a private note, if I can say it publicly. I just was writing to you when you talked in the first part of the shiur about why Moshe switches the order of Yisachar and Zvulun. I thought the traditional approach is because it was Zvulun were those who supported Torah. Smach Zvulun b'tzeitecha v'Yisachar bo'alecha. Yisachar was the tribe that stayed in their tents to learn Torah, and Zvulun was the one who went out with the business people. And the Torah is telling us that the people, the enablers, so to speak, in a positive sense, that the tribe of Zvulun is on a higher level, because they're the ones, the businessman who goes and writes the check to the yeshiva, to the day school, is on a higher level than the people who sit there and study Torah. That's what I always thought the interpretation was. I don't know if you've heard that or you have any comment on that.
Well, yes, I've heard that. Although I must just say that if the contemporary equivalent is Kollel, I think that precedence goes to the people who work for a living in order to make it possible for Kollelniks to sit and learn. But that's.
I'm not necessarily. I'm not. However, Kollel, day school, yeshiva, however you want to interpret it. But those people who enable Torah to happen are more important. We know that's true in all fields. Now, the quote unquote enabler is greater than the one who does the act himself. So that's Yisachar gave the ability. They created a society in which Jewish education could flourish, if you want to phrase it like that. But okay. Yes. That's one of the reasons. All right. I don't know any other questions. Otherwise, we'll thank Dr. Sokolow. Wish a good yontif. As I mentioned, tomorrow night, David Harbader, who wrote to me that he wants to get up at 3:00 in the morning because this is the book he wrote on Bereshit, dealing with the various the two stories of creation, how they contradict each other. So that's he'll be speaking 8:30 Eastern time tomorrow evening, Parshat Bereshit, Vzot Habracha Bereshit. And please God, I'll be giving my shiur Wednesday morning, my regular quote unquote siddur shiur. Will be on Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah, some parts of the siddur. That'll be 9:00 this week. Post 9:15 Wednesday morning. Wednesday morning, Hoshana Rabbah, 9:00, and then we'll get started after Yontif with a number of shiurim. Watch your emails, and thank you very much, and I want to wish everybody well. And this Shmini Atzeret should be much different than last year. That's all I can say. It should be much better. And I see all the things going around. The Hakafot being dedicated to this group and whatever. And everybody's saying we have to dance on Simchas Torah, but dance while, with the proper respect and remembrance the pain and suffering of the year, but also the Jewish people will not be denied, and we continue to march forward, and that's why we're here. 3,500 years ago, that's why we can meet and learn from around the world and learn Parshat Shavua and talk about the death of Moshe and Bereshit. We are a resilient, wonderful people, and we should be blessed with peace. The holiday of Sukkot should bring with it peace. All right, everybody. Amen. Hope to see you soon. And thank you very much. Laila Tov, everybody. Bye-bye.
Jay?
Yes?
You know that Alan Brill got into big trouble once for pointing out that the Rav's Adam 1 and Adam 2 was merely an adaptation of a early 19th century German Lutheran minister.
No, I did not know this. No, I mean, and right, the lonely man of faith, the Rev's, of course, great piece, which he deals, of course, in his own way with the contradictions, the contradictory stories of creation, chapter 1, chapter 2. He divides two types of man. But what did Alan Brill say exactly? What that it's
He showed that it was something. It was not that the Rav didn't give it original, but
he did
the
give it to a
notion.
non-Jewish audience. That talk and Lonely Man of Faith was delivered, I think, at a Catholic university, if I'm not mistaken.
Saying
Originally.
he showed that it is something that the Rav was acquainted with when he studied in Germany. It was a known piece, a known approach by, I don't remember the name, by an early 19th century German Lutheran minister.
I mean, is that true? I mean, just because people don't like it doesn't. Just because he got in trouble doesn't mean it's not true.
No, I'm sure it is.
Right. I mean, people
Sure
were
it is.
upset to hear that the Rav's Adam 1 and Adam 2 was not his complete original creation, that he adapted something from earlier. No, nothing wrong with that. There's nothing to be embarrassed about that. Yeah. The Rav puts it in his own style, and everybody does it. We all copy from other people and put our own personal twist on it. That's anyways, we build on the people before us, and right. But Dr. Sokolow, wasn't that talk given at a Catholic university, the Only Man of Faith, I believe?
I don't know.
You're not sure. If I'm not mistaken, it was originally delivered to non-Jews, and then became, unlike, let's say, Kol Doti Dofek that was given on Yom Ha'atzmaut, whatever. But okay, I haven't. Maybe I can read it this year. Although there's no time to study Bereshit. When you have Yontif on Thursday, Friday, Bereshit loses out. It's not fair because nobody has time to focus on that. All right, Laila Tov, everybody. Chag Sameach. Be well.
Laila Tov, Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Thank you.